Well, thank you very much to the Beshara Trust for inviting me, and to thank you all for coming. And I hope this will be of some interest to most people. I actually, in 2007, I was in Australia, in Melbourne, just outside of Melbourne, doing a 1 week, helping with a 1 week residential, not residential, but every day, all the day, for a week course on Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, as contained in his book on by Afifi. And at the end of that course, I'll say something more about it. At the end of that course, we've gone a full week and kind of immersed in this metaphysical world, and there's nothing, untoward about that. But anything outside that world, if there is such a thing outside it, anything outside that world about what was going on in the world at the moment didn't arise. So at the end of that course, I decided to write something which would bring it into relationship with some important issue that was facing the whole world. And that issue then was the beginning of the ecological crisis, or very near the beginning. It was coming to our notice. It had not been mentioned at all, and I was fine with that. But my view with Ibn Arabi, for what it's worth, but my view is that it has to have implication. An implication for the way we live, an implication for what vision of the future we may commit ourselves to. It's not just a metaphysical statement without profound implications. So I wrote this paper, and it's been delayed, partly delayed because of COVID, although I did give it to the Ibn Arabi Society to present the paper. But this is an updated form, and quite a lot of other things in it than was in the original paper. But let me talk about that moment in 2007 when the early version of the talk was originally given to a group of people, as I have said, attending a week-long residential course near Melbourne. The talk was delivered after the course had finished, or was it the finish of the talk? Could well be. The talk was delivered in the early evening in the intimacy of someone's living room. I remember, these things stay with you, visual images very often. I remember vividly people peering attentively through the banisters on the landing stairs as the talk progressed, which actually, and because of the week we'd spent together, gave a kind of atmosphere, an unexpectedly contemplative-like atmosphere. They were very, very receptive, which is a privilege. It became interesting to me, as I've said, that the topic of the ecological crisis, which is so very familiar to us now, had not been prefigured in any of the discussions during the week-long residential course, a week which had focused primarily on Ibn Arabi's metaphysics of unity. So that the original paper, which I had written a good number of years earlier to this, in that summer in the UK, I thought would be a kind of surprise end-of-course talk. It had a certain freshness which seemed to have engendered a small, of about 12, 14 people, a small but very captive audience. At the present time, and up to date, the whole world has been laid captive to those terrifying and unforgettable images of devastating winds, fires, drought, extraordinarily high temperatures, and large-scale human dislocation. And nearer to home, in the UK around that time, the threat to human and agricultural infrastructures by the increasing frequency and extent of hitherto unheard of floodwaters and periods of worrying drought, and the alarming threat to biodiversity itself. All these we're very, very familiar with now. And thereby, as one commentator puts it, it's rather nice, a nice way of doing it, it also, to the non-human fellow creatures on our planet. I think that's Tudge said that. And most fundamentally, to the already known global implications of rising sea levels, ocean and ocean warming. In fact, to summarise it, without going into technical detail, in fact, the ecological crisis hangs over the world like Damocles' sword. On a thread. A hair, I think it was, in the original story. Clearly, for all those of us concerned about humanity at large and the present and often catastrophic state of the world, the fundamental $1,000 question is whether humanity will be able to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. And what I'm asking is, are there any clear sentinel and signs of hope that this is not a caravan of despair? One such hope, although not universally held, involves a radical critique of the contemporary oligarchies of wealth and power. Even within a formally democratic system. And while kind of approaching this problem of oligarchy in a democratic system, I did a bit of research. This is kind of an aside, but an interesting aside, I think you'll see. This is by Robert Reich, who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford when Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, and they got together, and he was appointed to the administration, to Clinton's administration, Robert Reich, and he says this about this oligarchic situation. The most powerful force, and this is written in 2020 in a book that he about the system and how to remedy it. The most powerful force in American politics today is anti-establishment fury at a rigged system. There are no longer moderates. There is no longer a centre. Today's great divide, he says, is not between left and right. It is between democracy and oligarchy. And he writes vividly and powerfully on this thing, and he's a very well-informed commentator. But, you know, I have a niece, grandchild, who's at Manchester University studying politics and international relationships. And I asked her, what do you understand in your background about oligarchy? And she cited Russia, and she cited China, and that was the extent of her public knowledge. Well, you know, I said, well, it seems to me to have a life of its own these days, even within democracies, the influence of the powerful, the wealthy, and so on. So I think Robert Reich in the American tongue state had hit onto something that's becoming more and more important, perhaps. But I'm not going to go into that. But I did also come in this. It's not a side issue really, but it may appear it. A remark by George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and author, in his play, and I haven't read the play, Major Barbara, premiered in 1905 and first published in 1907. A new type of oligarchy, namely, he cites, the intellectual oligarchy. And he defines this as those acts against the interests of the common people. I now want to give the common man, this is George Bernard Shaw, now want to give the common man weapons against the intellectual man. I love the common people, he says. I want to arm them against the lawyer, the doctor, the priest, the literary man, the professor, the artist, and the politician, who once in authority is the most dangerous, disastrous, and tyrannical of all the fools, rascals, and impostors. Which is quite an insight. I want a democratic power strong enough to force the intellectual oligarchy to use its genius for the general good, or else perish. So, that's quite an interesting statement. And when people get into power, and substantial power, for a lot of people, they don't even seem to be imbued with any common sense. But there it is. So that's not a thing. One such hope, although not universally held, about the ecological crisis, one such hope involves a radical critique of the contemporary oligarchies of wealth and power, even within a formally democratic system. A critique which also questions many of the general premises of modern democratic politics. That is, which questions those premises, or some of them anyway, based on the awesome consumption and demands of an exponential growth of the world population, and which amplifies a predominant mantra, you might call it, of the virtues of competition, all of which are taken as a necessary key to the ultimate survival and well-being of modernity itself. We can note here the famous early reprimand of these premises, or such premises, given by Greta Thunberg, which we've all heard, but I will quote it because it's worth a hearing. People are suffering, she says. People are dying, and ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about, she says, is the money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you look away, she says, and come here saying that you're doing enough, when the politics and solutions are still nowhere in sight. Now that's a very famous statement of the times, very heartfelt, and from a young woman. You know, it had a powerful effect. One of the things that's happened, as we all know, is this exponential growth of human population. Never in the history of this planet have there been so many people, all having to be resourced from the earth. In an interesting note by Colin Tudge, who I mentioned earlier, in terms of population growth, that in the 2020, the British medical journal, the Lancet, cited a report by the Norwegian professor-scientist Stein Emil Volset of the University of Washington and his colleagues, which predicted that human numbers will peak before the end of this century and then fall rapidly. In some countries by more than 50%. This was the so-called sigmoid effect. You may have heard of it based on the Greek letters, 18th letter of the alphabet, the sigmoid effect, because it has a downside. These further issues, which I think we can put up on there, these further issues raise some serious questions in relation to the central title of today's talk. That is, Ibn Arabi and the ecological crisis. For example, how could the metaphysics of the 12th century Andalusian writer Ibn Arabi possibly be related to the challenging global climate changes of the 21st century? It may just seem, well, how is this possible? Why are we talking about this? Why is Ibn Arabi being brought in? Surely, some would say, such global environmental changes could not possibly have been prefigured in the 12th century by anyone. So why bring Ibn Arabi into it? Some would argue, of course, that Ibn Arabi's metaphysics of unity cannot be left out of the picture. Alternatively, people deeply engrossed in the ecological crisis may feel little need of any such metaphysics, for the crisis itself is so overwhelmingly urgent, universal, and to most scientists self-evident, that we have clearly enough on our plate without any need of metaphysics. But even the most, even if I accept some of that, even the most strident of the eco warriors admit that it necessarily involves a fundamental question of humankind's relationship to nature, from which we do not stand apart and to which we are intrinsically and indissolubly tied. We ourselves are part of nature, and this itself engenders, for many, a profound and human responsibility to respect and preserve the natural world in all its myriad diversity. We depend entirely on it. To delve into this ethical imperative requires knowledge, both a knowledge of nature and I'm going to suggest self-knowledge. That is, knowledge of ourselves and our human stewardship. It was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." One way of understanding this, is to begin to see knowledge as a form of encounter or participation, whether the encounter is within the deepest recesses of oneself, or the encounter with another human being, or with ideas, or music, or literature, or, of course, an encounter with the sheer awesomeness and beauty of the natural cosmic world, which can be both terrifying, edifying, and overwhelmingly inspiring. Or even, more centrally perhaps, the encounter with the social and historical realities of our own times, with the immediate tasks facing human survival and flourishing in the 20th century and beyond. We, looked at in this way, are mirrors to nature. We are the way in which, to put it rather picturesquely, we are the way in which nature sees itself. And nature is a mirror to us, reflecting back our lack of proper concern or otherwise. All of these encounters themselves constantly witness who and what we are. They stand as human witness to the fruits or otherwise of all our human dealings with the world. So the great mirror being unavoidable mirror of awareness here, with our human dealings with the world. In one sense then, this talk, as I'm gradually gently going into it, this talk is about the meaning of our times, about the here and now of everyday life and modernity in all its vicissitudes, and the predominant global issues, of which it is arguable the ecological crisis presents us with the most formidable. And I suggest that it is possible to look at this matter with fresh eyes and to suggest that the ecological crisis is more than an ecological crisis. That is, we can begin to see how the whole matter may be said to look from a universal, unitive, Akbarian perspective. I hope this is making some sense. We can begin to see ourselves, as many of us can, I believe, as theatres of manifestation of great internal and external forces, playing themselves out as our lives and lived experience, not simply and solely as a result of socio-historical and biological determinisms, but as the movement of love, as Ibn Arabi and many others have always insisted. And this despite some of the apparent appearances to the contrary. We may begin to make some sense of the American novelist Henry Miller's remarks that the earth is a paradise. We don't have to make it into one. It is one. We only have to make ourselves fit to inhabit it. I came across this rather pertinent insight in a recent book, an enormous book, but I don't know how he put it together, called The Enchantments of Mammon by Eugene Makahara. Really is quite a tome. I haven't read it all, but there's insights about the whole history of this matter, these kinds of matters. And it's called The Enchantments of Mammon. The earlier, to go back a bit, the earlier version of this talk was also presented at the AGM of the Ibn Arabi Society in Oxford in early November of 2007. It was equally inspired by the reading of the 29 pages, which is extracts from Afifi's book. I mean, Afifi's book was an attack on Ibn Arabi. He used some quite well-known philosophical arguments, but I won't go into those, but as an attack. But the remarkable thing about that attack is that he has had the common sense and decency to get, to present Ibn Arabi in a way that doesn't do him injustice. Kind of say, well, if you were to say what all this is about, Ibn Arabi, what would you say? Let him speak for himself, and the book is full of that. And Bülent Rauf took various parts of this book, organised them into a little book called, what is famous amongst certain people, the 29 pages, which is remarkable in itself, but it does have a transformative capacity. So that's where do we get to? The title of the talk was partly suggested from consulting the word hubris in the Oxford Shorter Dictionary, Volume 1, where there is an illustrative quotation from the author, Aldous Huxley. Hubris against the essential divine order of nature would be followed by its appropriate nemesis. Perhaps it might also be helpful to say, anyway, something about the use of the term modernity in the present context. The term modern world, as opposed to the term modernity, the term modern world includes practices and beliefs which may be considered unemancipatory and even medieval rather than modern, and includes many and diverse views about what is true and good, both secular and religious, both cognitive and moral, and includes perhaps even a postmodern incredulity towards any overarching account of what the world is like, or what the world should be. Some of the postmodernists would just say this is just a wasted task, we can't do it, it's not legitimate in some philosophical sense. By contrast, the term modernity, rather than modern world, generally refers to the preferred idea of human and social individual progress through the application of rationally based strategies, particularly exemplified in science, technology, and the calculative rationality of industrial and global capitalism. Or as one very good writer on this topic put it, in modernity, as Anthony Giddens puts it, the claims of reason replace those of tradition. I entitled the original version of this talk, Ibn Arabi and the Ecological Crisis, a Merciful Nemesis, question mark. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that question mark, is it? How can it be a merciful nemesis? Is it a merciful nemesis? Given when we see what the devastation and the human dislocation that it causes. As we shall see, the question mark is important. So I'm putting that question mark to us all and to myself. In an earlier work, which I called Ibn Arabi in Modern Thought, which I had published in 2003, I noted with some seriousness that modernity is engendering its own metaphysical crisis about the nature of knowledge itself and about its inevitable relation to human responsibility and human potential. It was very much a work which pointed to the hubris of much modern knowledge and the necessity for a reorientation of perspective beyond the self-descriptions and division of the age. I still hold this view. And Ibn Arabi goes on to give us some how these self-descriptions and the visions of the age take us over. He's very good at pointing just how this works and why, without condemning it. It's part of the necessary scheme of things in some sense. At the beginning of the 21st century, our awareness of the emerging ecological crisis and its predicted global consequences has been well documented. This is primarily because global warming affects every living thing on this planet, every human infrastructure and every human soul. More and more it is becoming obvious, almost too obvious, that something very serious is happening to the world climate, and this even when there may be vested interests by some in denying its human causes. Optimism and pessimism abound. For what it's worth, I'm a serious optimist. But we must be very careful where we place our optimism. For if the causes are what human beings are doing to the planet, then the solution requires changing human behaviour in fairly radical ways, in the short term and in the long term. It requires, or so it seems, urgent change at both the personal and political level. In this paper, I propose to delve deeper, or more deeply, into the nature of this crisis from the perspective of the unity of existence, and to suggest that there is another universal dimension to its meaning. First, let us notice that the idea of unity, if you wish, the acknowledgement of our common universal humanity, is increasingly brought to our attention in all kinds of 21st century nooks and crannies. Obviously, this idea is not yet formulated in strictly Akbarian sense, but its contemporary formulations may be a useful and preparatory step in the right direction. There is definitely emerging a sense and recognition of the interconnectedness and unity of life as a whole, and of the indissoluble relationship between man, woman and nature. We see images of fundamental unity emerging in the very small and the very great. in cosmology, physics, biology, ecology, economics, and in the global interdependence of diverse, socially, culturally and geographically disparate communities, and even in some ecumenical concepts. And who was good at the ecumenical concept thing was Don Sylvester, who used to talk about that in his own special way. Won't forget those talks. More generally, though, we see this in the breaking down of barriers of all kinds, including gender. There is a kind of healthy unity in diversity, and diversity in unity, replacing constricting dualisms. It may, in many ways, holistic understandings have become more prevalent. We need to recognise this tendency. I think we really do need to recognise this tendency when considering the all too obvious divisions of the age in which we live. We may even suggest, I suppose I'm suggesting it, we may even suggest that the ecological crisis itself is, in some partial and potential sense, a unifier, insofar as it is ultimately larger than the divisions which separate us. We cannot act alone, and we are all affected. Such embryonic degree of unity, a feeling for the oneness of life, is in many people, I suspect, part of a taken for granted common sense. Not much talked about, perhaps, but a powerful subterranean current, a potential antidote to intolerance and division. People can gather in the name of their common humanity, in spite of their sometimes intransigent ideological divisions. I remember somewhere reading about Muhammad, just reminded me of it, reading that, where he was in conversation with various tribes and trying to, preserve peace. And as far as I remember, I won't have got all the details right, but the spirit of it is right, that they said, well, we can't accept this document. We can't accept calling you a prophet. And Muhammad's reply, or Muhammad's action, was, well, then cut it out. It's more important to have peace. And I think it's a very revealing way that we can be. And it's that attitude in various forms is a unifier. Well, I mean, obviously one example here would be, though it's had some ups and downs, as we know, was what happened in Ireland. And, how people who once couldn't look at each other ended up talking to each other. And they couldn't stand the sight of each other. Arch enemies. Somehow or other were brought together and talked. And things happened through that bringing together, fortunately, but still many problems, of course. So the peace deal in Northern Ireland, 1998, is a promising example, perhaps, and is still extant in spite of its political institutions being, in more recent times, in cold storage. That's in Ireland. Sometimes it takes great preparation for something seemingly solid to melt into air. And sometimes it happens in the twinkling of an eye. And sometimes it happens in the twinkling of an eye, or even less, as it is sometimes tantalizingly expressed. I myself cannot think of a better description of how great shifts in human consciousness and ideas take place than this. If the argument of this short paper could be summarised, it is that the ecological crisis itself acts as a mirror, or even, better still, a magnifying glass, for the necessity of a fundamental change in human consciousness and awareness. It is a crisis capable of bringing the human species, hopefully, to its senses. It is more than an ecological crisis. It is a mirror to the towering nature of much of our stewardship of the world. It is therefore inescapably a mirror to ourselves, to our state, to our attitude. We have forgotten or ignored that which Ibn Arabi bids us to constantly remember, that we are all al-ayan, the essence of his most perfect names, dressed in space and time. We are images of truth, and the difference of cultures and beliefs is in fact an intentional diversity, predicated on the mercy of the most merciful. In another way, each one of us is in potential an essential witness in the service to what has traditionally been referred to as the unity of existence. Which oneness, that is the oneness of the unity of existence, which oneness most definitely includes the ecology of the planet in all its fine-tuning. There is a phrase in Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam which outstandingly summarises what it is I propose to outline in the context of this talk. It is the phrase translated in as the clarification of the mirror of the world. When I first read this, came across this, it hit me like a bombshell. What's going on is the clarification of the mirror of the world. And it occurs in the following passage. This is from Ibn Arabi, Fusus al-Hikam. For the entire reality, from the beginning to its end, comes from God alone, and it is to him that it returns. So then, the divine order required the clarification of the mirror of the world. Adam became the light of itself of this mirror and the spirit of this form. So it is this phrase, the clarification of the mirror of the world. It's possible to see all of this going on now. Although, for Ibn Arabi, this act of divine self-consciousness, mirroring, has already occurred in totality outside the parameters of space and time. Its consequences are being played out in the world of manifest images, in the here and now, if I'm right, or anywhere near right, in the here and now of everyday life and modernity, in all its vicissitudes. Its consequences are being played out, to use a phrase from Max Weber, which I like very much, are being played out in the infinity of the world process. Very famous line in Max Weber, which I like very much. Played out in the infinity of the world process. So now let us look at some of the historical and cultural detail of which we are well aware and examine it freshly from the perspective of the clarification of the mirror of the world. It is an extraordinary fact that in the 18th century Europe, 18th century, 1750, it's usually given the date in the beginning, in the 18th century Europe, the greatest transformation happened in human history since remote times. there was a massive exponential demographic explosion, such that later, going quite a bit later, by 1940s and 1960s, there was an increase in the space of just over 20 years of more than the total estimated population of the world in 1800. This is an astounding fact. And as we know, the exponential growth continues. All these billions of human beings on the face of the planet is unprecedented in its history. This demographic explosion was paralleled, as we know, by new industrial processes taking place on a grand scale. The Industrial Revolution was born, and it was born in the West. Central to its prodigious development was the emergence of a new scientific and technological attitude to nature, towards knowledge, and towards the world in general. In short, as it's often been mentioned by Mumford, in short, there was a reorientation of ideas and a climatic change in human consciousness. And most importantly, it is a fact that the demographic explosion was and is the biggest challenge to its resources that the planet has ever known. The teeming globality of the 21st century acts as a mirror to our human condition, revealing unambiguously the acceptable and unacceptable human consequences of our actions. The kaleidoscopic mirror we call the 21st century global life is ubiquitous. It is at our every turn. We need just to watch television, and there it is, right in front of our eyes, in our own living rooms. Even after evening, a constant stream of the images of modernity being presented, demanding its presence in our consciousness. But if we look in this mirror with Akbarian eyes, what do we see? Well, it is possible to extrapolate certain discernible features. Let us deal with two general points first. Firstly, as Izutsu points out, the meaning that is perceived in the theatre of modernity, the meaning we give to all this going on, how it is perceived in us, the meaning that is perceived in the theatre of modernity, Izutsu says, is inseparably connected with the subjective state of man, so that the self-same reality is said to be perceived differently in accordance with different degrees of awareness and consciousness. For Ibn Arabi, it is the conscious awareness of the unity of existence which informs his vision, and it is to this which he invites the would-be searcher. From this universal perspective, Ibn Arabi informs us, and this is another line that has huge implications and power, if it's up there. The world is to itself, says Ibn Arabi, its own veil, and thus cannot see God, due to the fact that it sees itself. So we kind of become engrossed in a certain consciousness of things, which it also acts as a veil. Now, of course, veils can also reveal. What's behind the veil can be revealed in certain ways. So, but it is a veil which engrosses us in certain ways. Because of this, because we, as part of that world, are veiled in this way, there is a great forgetting about the true reality of man. The human images of the Ayan, historically projected, as it were, and genetically codified in space and time, image in reality but a fraction of their great primordial nature. but a fraction of reality. But fortunately, as I've mentioned, a veil can both conceal and reveal, be both subtle and coarse. Veils also act as a symbol, and this is very important in Ibn Arabi. Veils also act as a symbol and a reminder of what they veil. And it is interesting to remember that there are two types of veil for Ibn Arabi. There are humanly constructed veils, which we construct ourselves and in groups and whatever. There are humanly constructed veils, and there are those veils which God, in His wisdom, has placed before man. The global mirror of the 21st century, through which we see as through a veil, can nevertheless act as a dramatic admonishment or reminder, or both, of which perhaps the ecological crisis stands as a paradigmatic global instance. It is an admonishment of lack of our proper overall stewardship and reminder at the same time of our utter dependence on nature. We've seen quite some things this week which demonstrate that. We know that we must treat nature properly, that we must learn to work with nature and to understand its infinitely complex ecology at every level. We know too, therefore, and this is, I think, quite important, I suppose, that we know too, therefore, there is a point beyond which it is not always possible to pull ourselves out of every difficulty by our own bootstraps. The ecological crisis, therefore, also recertifies the spiderweb fragility of the humanly built environment and its infrastructures. Most importantly of all is that the ecological crisis is a reminder that we have to change. And it is to the necessity of real change that global events in the 20th century are focusing our attention, like a gigantic magnifying glass. A little more deeply, in no uncertain terms, that we are indissolubly tied to a global movement of epic proportions, beyond politics, beyond financial institutions and corporations, beyond world ideologies and beyond power struggles, which has to do with a universal transformation of human awareness. Many of the dramatic events of the 21st century are a wake-up call to all of its 6 billion inhabitants. If this call is to change, if this call to change takes the form of an ecological nemesis, with which we will, willy-nilly, we'll have to deal with it, it also heralds a universal message of hope. The magnifying glass of modernity can act as an indelible reminder of what, according to Ibn Arabi, applies to each one of us. And I quote, "What is within you and what is in your possession that you have forgotten?" And that is, Ibn Arabi continues, that you, speaking to this ever forgotten, that you are everything, in everything, and from everything. This knowledge of the spiritual meaning of the indissoluble unity of all life at all levels, material and spiritual, continues a reviving scent and mercy. It is a single movement of love, which, in spite of its inverse appearances, ensures, and this is Ibn Arabi, that the inner realities of the spiritual world will become more and more manifest and accessible. This is not meant to imply that the world population as a whole will comply with this accessibility, for it is essentially a private and individual matter which depends on the predisposition of each individual human receptor. But the invitation is there in Ibn Arabi for those who will accept it. Consider the following comments of Ibn Arabi about this matter. He says, relating to the times he was about, but it's got application, obviously. The time today, he says, isn't like times in the past. It's closer to the realm of the next world, so that its people experience more spiritual unveiling. So the people of this time, today, are quicker to experience unveiling, more likely to witness spiritual things, more spiritually aware, and more complete in their realization. But also more deficient in their right actions than in earlier times, because they are farther from the companions in their witnessing of the Prophet. For right actions were more predominant in the past, as he puts it, while spiritual knowing is more predominant in this time of ours. And that expansion of spiritual awareness will continue on increasing until the descent of Jesus, peace be upon him, at the end of time. Now, how should I put this? The understanding of this, the spiritual, the descent of Jesus, can be understood in a number of ways. But two of the most important ones are, I suppose, that it's going to be a great historical event. It's going to be a great historical event in humankind. The other way, which many kind of critics and writers have pointed out, is it's going on all the time. It's in us. It's not out there, it's in us. This battle, this movement, this great change is going on now in us, if we are aware of it. For some, this expansion of spiritual awareness is sometimes taken to refer to the special rewards of those who will continue to strive for God in the corrupted circumstances of these latter days. That's certainly one view. But when considering the University of Ibn Arabi's vision and his God-given status as an unlimited mercifier, absolutely compassionate, this view of the matter begins to seem unduly restrictive. For we can see also the expansion of awareness of the unity of existence, foreshadowed in all those images of wholeness emerging in 20th century cosmology, physics, and the life sciences, including, obviously, ecology. So far as Ibn Arabi is concerned, the fundamental principle that he's based on, really, to some extent, is that the spiritual governs the material everywhere, whether we recognize it or not. Consequently, the expansion of spiritual awareness must involve, at the personal level, an ongoing recognition and personal acceptance of this principle. What we call material, where have we got to? What we call material on this view would be nothing other than a description of things which fails to recognize the theophanic secret of the atom. This is another one of his things. And this is unequivocally stated by Ibn Arabi, the global movement of our time prefigures the manifestation of the Messianic age or the second coming of Jesus, also known as the Parousia. That's a name that's often used for this, Parousia. Whether we conceive of this, as I've mentioned, as a future historical event or as an ongoing inner transformation of human consciousness and spiritual realization. I myself certainly can give countenance to the idea of ongoing inner transformation. At any rate, it carries no ultimate negative connotations in Ibn Arabi's philosophy of absolute compassion. We may surmise that all kinds of spiritual opportunities are being opened up and exteriorized, in inverted commas, until the descent of Jesus. And this is always in accordance with the inner structure of our own archetypal predispositions, as essences in the divine ipseity, as he says, and ideas in God's vision of himself. So whatever is going on here is not searching for vision of God, it's searching for God's vision of himself, which is quite different in impetus. It is interesting to note also that Ibn Arabi hints that there are exceptions to this rule, which allow man an absolutely unconditional insight into the mystery of being beyond their own archetypal predisposition. There is further and more. Comes in a line in, one of the ways this is stated is a line in the chapter on Muhammad in the Fusus al-Hikam, where he says, there are those who I want to see me equally. And it suggests, well, I won't say any more about that. It was the Prophet Muhammad who said the following, "Oh my God, show me things clearly," meaning by things whatever is beside God, whose name be exalted. That is, make me know what is beside thee, in order that I may understand which they are, whether they be thou or other than thou, whether they be old, abiding, or recent and perishing. Then God showed him what was beside himself, without the existence of what is beside himself. So he saw things as they really are. This request for clarity, show me things clearly, this request of Muhammad for clarity in this prayer, this request for clarity is also a request for ablution, so that all else is abluted except God's face. This is the zenith of spiritual awareness, which has neither beginning nor end nor beginning, where there is neither subject nor object. All this, the extraordinary stories and descriptions in the Fusus al-Hikam, for instance, in the Tarjum al-Ashwaq, and the Sufis of Andalusia, those bits translated by Ralph Austin, and much more, are Ibn Arabi tells us, and this is quite important if you to take this matter at all seriously, I suppose. He says, all these stories, all these events, all this contained in the Fusus and beyond, he says, they're only bridges and passageways set up so that we can cross over them into our own essence selves and our own particular states. So there are bridges to help us to pass over into this deeper situation. Often, and this is personal, often when we take stock of our own lives and try to make some intelligible sense of it, we realize that we have received much more than we can ever have imagined. That the unfolding story of our lives, each one of us, is remarkable and unique, and has that, who would have thought that, quality about it. The last paper on Nietzsche, he was very good at pointing this out. Who would have thought that this could have happened to me? How did it come about? So to realise that we've received already more than we could ever imagine. It's a big thing. There is a memorable line, I quote this often because I like it. There is a memorable line in Pirandello, in a play that goes on in the West End fairly often, called Six Characters in Search of an Author. It's a wonderful idea, and in the preface to that he says, there is someone living my life and I know nothing about him. And as we have seen, if we take Ibn Arabi seriously, there is someone living the era and we don't know who it is. But we are told, do not revile the era, for he, God, is the era. The inner core of our era is the movement of love, which is his beauty and his love and his vision to be known. We turn now to another writer along these lines, Eckhart, Meister Eckhart. I don't know whether the book's been published yet, has it? On the biography of Eckhart, Dom Sylvester's.
I think it has.
It's been published, yeah. And anyway, this is what Eckhart says in his own context. God lies in wait for us with nothing so much as with love. For love resembles the fisherman's hook. The fisherman cannot get the fish till it is caught on the hook. Once it takes the hook, he is sure of the fish. Twist and turn as it may, this way or that, he is assured of his catch. And so I say of love, this way or that. And so I say of love, he who is caught by it has the strongest of bonds, and yet a pleasant burden. He who has taken up this sweet burden fares farther and makes more progress than by all the harsh practices that men use. And he too can cheerfully bear and endure all that befalls him. Whatever God inflicts on him, and can also cheerfully forgive what evil is done to him. Nothing brings you closer to God, says Eckhart, or makes God so much your own as that sweet bond of love. The man who has found this way need seek no further, need seek no other. He who hangs on this hook is caught so fast that foot and hand and mouth and eyes and heart and all that is man's belongs only to God. And Ibn Arabi himself says very, very similar things. Our era, if I'm right, is imbued with a particular quality of the real, but it is we who must exercise discernment and read between the lines, so that we grasp securely the meaning of our own times. We are not left alone in this matter. How could we be? Even the slightest glimmer into the unity of existence contains a message of hope. The Fusus al-Hikam of Ibn Arabi is an essential gift given to us all to strengthen and revivify our hearts. People of the Fusus are under the general order of the essential requirement of the time in which we live, and God willing, shall come to see clearly what is to be done and what the signs of the times truly indicate. In this context, the clarification of the mirror of the world in the era of the 21st century is the preparation of a universal platform of education so that we may see clearly what is ahead. The Beshara School, and what is now called Chisholm Institute, is itself an evolving prototype of universal education for the future. Whether people gather in his name as one for his vision, wherever people, gather in his name as one for his vision, Beshara is present in total. It is not necessary to be elsewhere. In fact, it is necessary that we are not elsewhere, but undividedly present where we are. When we place ourselves under the order of his meaning, it is possible to become aware of his presence according to itself, wherever we are. On the Piccadilly line here. This is his self-gift to us all. I shall mention a memorable line from one of Haftar's poems, entitled, "Shall I Ever Find the One?" He says, just one line from his poem, "The day will come when touching the earth I see the world of the real." A line which is beautiful. And in the meantime, and in the unprecedented turbulence of the 21st century, perhaps it is not inappropriate to remember and conclude, though I'm not quite concluding, to remember to conclude once again with the lines from Nifri, the Book of Spiritual Addresses, Address 1. Nifri says this: "If I had not stretched over thee the compassion of mercifulness, the hand of temporality would have folded thee against Gnosis. If the lights of my superbness had not shone upon thee, the destroying winds of abasement would have destroyed thee, and the sweeping winds of change would have swept thee away." The sweeping winds of change. There's plenty of those these days. Having written all this, we can begin to understand, or at least glimpse a little, how these influences work and can be noticed. To this end, and to return to ecology, which was our starting point, I want to conclude by mentioning in an email somewhere I received some time ago, after completing what I have read to you so far. It was an email from a Brazilian student who brought his wife over and small child to Chisholm House. It was an email from a Brazilian student who, with his wife and son, were at the time visiting Portugal, and through a colleague, he had heard of a residential one-week course being held at Chisholm Institute on the mystical philosophy of Ibn Arabi, known as the 29 Pages. I remember their arrival clearly, as they drew up in their hired car. The week's course was quite intensive, considering in study, meditation, help with the house and estate and other practices. He himself joined the course, while his wife looked after their son. I remember noticing, at the end of the course, when I was saying, well, that's it, kind of thing, I remember noticing that the whole of his copy of the 29 pages was highlighted in a coloured marker, line by line. I hadn't heard anything of how he was doing, because he went back to Brazil. I hadn't heard anything of how he was doing until an unexpected email arrived. He mentions in it that in 2018, after recovering from a period of serious illness, He created an ecology centre, and I quote, this is from him: "We work with the meeting of scientific and traditional local knowledges, with sensitive, collaborative, non-extractive methodologies, with art as a basis for interculturality and an ethical academy. Our motto is the phrase," he says, "I kept from our last conversation, because I was helping out with it: unity in diversity and diversity in unity." Ibn Arabi, he says, continues to inspire me on a daily basis. At the moment, we are working hard with an indigenous ethnic group in the Amazon and the Munduruku. My intention is to combine knowledge and wisdom with traditional peoples and what cities and modernity can learn in this sensitive and difficult moment of civilization. If we look carefully at this, we can see that it is not to imply a question of temporal cause and effect, and certainly not a matter of mere coincidence, but rather an experiential continuity of meaning according to the nature and receptivity of the recipient. Ibn Arabi himself is described as a meaning. So perhaps we can say with some confidence and relevance, Ibn Arabi is a meaning for our times. Could this itself begin to explain the increasing resurgence of interest in Ibn Arabi in the 21st century? Perhaps this is not so speculative a point to consider as we break for afternoon refreshment. It is certainly a message of profound hope. Thank you.